You're listening to the Educate, Enable and Empower Show, a podcast from the Scottish Women's Development Forum in which we sit down with inspiring women and others to listen to their stories, life lessons and perspectives. In this podcast, I sit down with Joanne McEwan. Joanne began her policing career in Fife Constabulary and has performed a range of policing roles, including response, community policing, public protection, major investigations, event command and corporate functions. She is passionate about policing, partnership working and service to our communities. Joanne is chair of the Women of Colour in Policing subcommittee. Established this year, this committee seeks to collaborate with internal and external partners, diversity staff associations and allies to explore the complex space of intersectionality and to enhance the visibility, voice, representation and experience of women of colour in policing. Here's Joanne to tell us a little more.
Hi, my name is Joanne McEwan. I'm a police officer in Police Scotland and a member of the Scottish Women's Development Forum. The SWDF has, as most people will be aware, been bringing a voice and a focus to the career experiences, challenges and achievements of women in policing for many years. Increasingly, we've been giving a great deal of thought to intersectionality. We recognise that we are more than one thing and that we each have very different and individual lived experiences. In my case, I'm a woman, I'm black, I'm a mother, a daughter, and of course, a police officer. So I'm very interested to gain a fuller understanding of intersectionality. What does it really mean? What is the impact? And what can we as a Diversity Staff Association do to ensure it's a central part of our conversations and considerations in our efforts to improve the experience of officers and staff? Important too, to consider how Sir Ian Livingstone's statement, relevant to institutional discrimination, offers us all an opportunity to maintain and build momentum around matters of inclusivity and address this multifaceted aspect of underrepresentation. Academic researchers suggest that the impact of intersectionality, particularly when race is a factor, is exponential, that it's greater than the sum of its parts. A description that resonates with me is women of colour may feel like the outsider and have a very fragile sense of belonging. This may well be a factor when we consider the low level of representation of women of colour in policing nationally and particularly in positions of seniority or influence. The National Police Chiefs Council has recognised the challenge and introduced a dedicated lead for women of colour in policing and a growing national network aimed at positive change in this space. My own sense is that the impact of intersectionality as it pertains to race is incredibly difficult to define and quantify. With that in mind, the SWDF are introducing a Women of Colour in Policing subcommittee that will have a specific focus on attempting to better understand the career experiences of women of colour and to reflect that in our activities, to work in partnership with other staff associations and to support organisational change. I'm delighted to kick off our focused activity by introducing you to a series of podcasts where we will hear from fantastic women of colour who work for and with Police Scotland as they share with you their personal perspectives.
Welcome to the Scottish Women's Development Forum podcast series. I'm your host, Jenny Stewart, and I'm the Deputy Chair of the SWDF. Today I'm joined by Joanne McEwan, who's the Chair of our newly formed Women of Colour in Policing subcommittee. Welcome, Joanne.
Hi, Jenny. Good to be here.
So tell me, you've had 23 years police service now. Mm-hmm. That must have been some experience and career. Can you tell me a little bit about your journey so far?
Yeah, it has been, I suppose, in a lot of different ways. I joined the police in January of 2000, and I always remember it was the 6th of January, and do you remember the millennium and the year 2000 and all the things that were going to happen?
Y2K.
Yeah, exactly. And we were the first course of the new millennium. And actually, our claim to fame is a tree planted for us at the college, which I walk past it actually as whenever I'm at the college and see it there. So yeah, it was. In some ways, it seems like a long time ago, and in other ways, it doesn't seem like any time at all.
Yeah.
That I joined, and it was an interesting time because in this series of podcasts we're talking about race and women of colour, and it was an interesting time because the Macpherson report had been published just the year before, 1999, and I guess what I didn't realise then as a 21-year-old new recruit, I didn't realise that there was a lot of conversation going on about race and policing and the service that we provided to the community. And I suppose it's interesting to me as we sit here nearly 24 years later, more than that from the Macpherson report and the death of Stephen Lawrence, that we're still having those conversations. So I suppose for me, it's interesting to see how much has changed, but in some ways how little has changed as well. But my journey was really good. And I always start by saying that I've spent every day of my job enjoying it, and I don't think a lot of people get to say that, Joined, started in response, loved it. Wasn't called response then, but loved it. And then moved into community policing. Spent a lot of time doing that and enjoyed that as well. Always felt to me what policing was about, wearing your uniform, answering the calls, helping people. And then through various different promotions, kind of moved into different roles and did different things. Spent time in corporate roles, in public protection, through Operation Tala, for example. Spent time in resilience and resourcing, huge challenges there, and now in a much more corporate role as a chief inspector, and looking forward on promotion later this year to a new role as a superintendent. So so many different opportunities that I've had, but I guess the golden thread for me has just been fantastic, and enjoyed every minute of it.
It does sound like a very varied career, and I suppose what I would ask, is there a favourite in there that you've ever done that you thought, wow, this is just it for me? Or do you think that kind of, you said you've had a really good career throughout, do you think that goes to all of them, or was that one?
I think there is one. It goes to all of them, and I don't think that's because of necessarily the roles themselves. I think it's because of the people that you work with. And difficult because I came to the police straight out of uni, so I don't really know other organisations, but I find it hard to believe you'll find one where the sense of team is the same. I think you feel like a part of a team. You feel you're there for each other. The humour, the support has always been there, no matter what role I've been in. So I think that's what, even in the hardest and most difficult and challenging roles, I think that works. But for me, I think community policing is the one that I take the most out of, because it just resonates with me. You feel connected to the community. You feel that you're doing something that matters to them. And it can be something small, but it can be huge for that person. And I think as community officers, we are, or often are, people who are really relied upon and trusted. And I think that's important. And I think that speaks again to that importance about diversity and why it's important that we understand our communities and how to support them well so that they can trust us. And actually, when you've been in the police for a long time like we have, you start to see as a community officer, now as a community constable, sergeant, inspector, you see the generations of people moving through. And I think what is most rewarding to me about community policing is that we're not operating at the last point, the point where the bad thing has happened and a victim has been victimised, created. You have an opportunity, I think, in community policing to stop that from happening. And so for me, that's always been what I've enjoyed most.
I like that idea. Connection with people, connection with your communities. And talking about people, you said that was one of your favourite things about being with people on your team. Now, this might not be a person, it could be a thing, but has there been anything in particular that inspired you to go into policing, or was there any person in particular?
There wasn't a person, and I always think it's interesting because I remember the tagline, you can't be what you can't see. And when I joined the police, there wasn't anybody who looked like me. There were very few women. There were no black women. I might be wrong about that, but there were no black women that I can remember. There certainly weren't any in my legacy force. So it wasn't something that I looked at and thought, that's the job for me, or I knew anybody who'd been in the police, or I had a family of police officers or anything like that. What it was, actually, weirdly, it was a very small article in a newspaper that I saw, because people used to read newspapers.
I remember that.
Horribly old. When I graduated uni, I did psychology at uni. And I kind of had this idea about psychology, about being, remember Cracker, the TV programme?
Robbie Coltrane?
Yeah, being really exciting and hard-edged and all that. It was nothing like that. But what it was, I suppose, it's about human behaviour. And I think police is a lot about human behaviour as well. Why people are who they are, how they are, why they do what they do, group dynamics and all that kind of thing. So I suppose I had that kind of basic interest in that. And then while I was at uni, I worked in the bank just as a job to, keep you going. And when I graduated, I just naturally continued in that job for a few months, trying to decide what I was going to do. And what I realised was that I found that horribly boring, just full-time working in the bank, commuting in the morning, commuting home. Just wasn't for me. It wasn't for me at all. And any job that just involved being in an office all day, doing the same thing over, wasn't for me. And it was during that time that I saw the advert in the newspaper, and I just thought, you know what, I'm going to do that. And it was really as simple as that. And I never looked back, because, as I say, I knew almost from, I guess, the moment I landed at the training college that it was the right choice for me. Yeah.
Did you feel, in a way, I've spoken to a lot of women in our members in the SWDF about that calling. Did you feel a calling to serve your communities?
I think to public service I did. Yeah. And I do wonder sometimes if I hadn't joined the police, I might have joined some other part of public service. I think growing up, I was born in 1978 and grew up through the 80s and 90s, and I suppose times were different then. So there was a lot of racism where I grew up in Scotland, very underrepresented, really, in minority, more so than we are now. So I suppose that was challenging in parts. Lived in a very deprived community as well. So I saw the impacts of that growing up, how it affected me, my family, the wider community. And so I think I really did see public service as something that allowed me to make a difference or give back to the communities where I was raised, and to young people or vulnerable people who were like me, I guess. So yeah, I would say if not the police, probably would have been something else. But I do think that's the thing about the police. It's a caring profession, I think. And some people might not realise that, but I think it's an awful lot of what we do.
Oh, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. In this series of podcast, we're looking at intersectionality. It's that buzzword that we hear all around. A lot of people don't quite understand it, and other people understand it very well. What it means, how it might influence the experience of women, and especially women of colour. What does intersectionality mean to you?
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head when you say, that it's complex and people might not understand what it means. And I absolutely don't profess to really truly understand what it means or what it has meant for me. It's that idea, isn't it? It's about taking protected characteristics that are multiple, that the layering of them, and how does that affect your life, whether it's your race, your gender, your religion, any element of protected characteristic. How does that change your experience of life, of work? How does it change how people see you, receive you, treat you? And I think for me, for women of colour, I think there is definitely a challenge around about being a woman and being a woman of colour. I don't see it. I think it's difficult as an individual to see how does it affect me, because you only see the world through your eyes and your lived experience. And I think for me, I've always tried to have a really positive outlook, so not to make assumptions or take a negative view of how I might be treated or the things that might have impacted me. But I think the reality is there when we look at the themes. We know that women of colour are often in society less respected, less regarded, receive less empathy, are less well represented in good jobs or roles, and that's not just in policing but in general. We know that they often receive less or not as good care in the health system, or are less valued in education. So there's a real issue there. And I think it's important that we have the conversations that acknowledge that, understand why, but also as a woman of colour, for me, the important part is about creating support and networks, because I've spoken before about the resilience that you need, or that I think you need, to navigate that as a woman of colour. And so I think having a supportive network, the SWDF for me is that supportive network, and the Women of Colour in Policing Subcommittee is an additional aspect to that. And I think it's been, for me, that's been the core of why it's important.
It's a really interesting perspective on intersectionality, and I've seen, you've probably seen it as well. They call the wheel of privilege. Mm-hmm. I think that kind of, for me, explains intersectionality really, really well, and I'm acutely aware of where I am on that wheel of privilege. So as an ally, I know that I will sit naturally higher up because of the colour of my skin. So how can I, as an ally, help women of colour?
I think, the wheel of privilege for me, I think you make a really good point. If anybody hasn't seen it, it's really good to look at. It's a really good visual representation of what it means. And I'm always conscious as well to recognise that myself, because I was at an event recently, it was Semper and Policing Together event, and heard officers speak. And many of them speaking about difficulties and challenges that they've had. And what really struck me was that the officers who spoke, who are still having those challenges now, that I thought were, or had hoped perhaps were a thing of the past, they didn't have English as a first language. And it struck me that, when we think about the wheel of privilege, I do have English as a first language. Born in this country, I'm very aware of how in some ways that has meant things have been less challenging for me. And therein is the nub of it with equality and diversity. It's recognising that we may all have similarities in terms of protected characteristics, but we each have very different experiences, and giving voice to that, hearing that. So as an ally, what can you do? I think it's what you're doing now. I think it's saying, we see you, we hear you, we validate you and your experience, and actually we're going to work together, because we've spoken before, a lot in common. Just as women, we have a lot in common. But what I love about the SWDF is that recognition that we're more than women. We've got other elements to us as well, and that real maturity of thought, I think, to move with that and delve into an area that actually it can be quite complex.
Yeah, absolutely. So recently, Sir Ian Livingston, our former Chief Constable, now retired, made a statement that Police Scotland is institutionally racist, sexist and discriminatory. How did you feel when you heard his statement?
I was in England when the statement came out. I was in writing at the College of Policing. I was delivering, actually interestingly, I was delivering leadership training to underrepresented officers, and staff. And I'd been there, I think I was about halfway through the week, and so surrounded by officers from England and Wales. So as you can imagine, it created quite the interest. Yeah. When Sir Ian's statement was played and it was on the news and so on. And I think it created a lot of interest because of the Casey review and the view or the position that had been taken by the Met. When I heard the statement, I guess first of all, I wasn't surprised, but I was surprised by how I felt about it, I would say. The first one was I felt a little bit conflicted. And I suppose I can really appreciate how a lot of officers feel when they heard the statement, that feeling of that it was a personal reflection on them. Mm-hmm. Because I thought, here is an organisation that I have spent 23 years of my life working for, that I have a great deal of pride in, and it's institutionally discriminatory. And what does that say about me, as a person? But that kind of thought moved on quite swiftly, and then I felt, I guess, vindicated might be the right word, heard or seen, to have Sir Ian, the most senior person in the organisation, to say, I acknowledge that this is an issue. I acknowledge it's a challenge for us, and actually we're going to do something about it. I felt that was really important. And that, I guess, made me feel hopeful, and I'm still hopeful now that we'll see the changes that we need to see. And spoke at the start about the Macpherson report, and I know that did not pertain to Scotland, but I guess we felt at that time that was a seminal moment for policing. And it turned out not to be, because we still have the challenges so many years on. And I hope, because the statement from Sir Ian was so honest and courageous, in my opinion, that is going to allow us to see that change. It won't be quick, it won't be straight away, but I do think it will come.
As you say, that seminal moment, that hands up moment of, what, this is who we are, we acknowledge that. I think sometimes we forget, and especially as leaders, that we have to get comfortable with the uncomfortable to get into that better space. What would you like to see as a result of that statement? What do you see in the future of policing? If you've got a decade ahead of you, what would you like to see on your day of your retirement?
I think as you get to this stage in service, I do think you start to think about what does policing look like when you've moved on, and do you leave it in a way that was better than you found it. I think you spoke about sitting with the discomfort, feeling uncomfortable. I think that's where we are just now, and I think we need to keep doing that, and we are doing it, and doing it well, having conversations like this, the Policing Together strategy supported by the staff associations. I think we're doing that, we're getting there, but it's more of that. It's keeping the momentum, listening to communities, and with honesty, but taking what people tell us and then doing something about it. I do think what we must see now is tangible change. So what does success look like? We need to understand the metrics of success so that we can actually, in 10 years, say, yeah, this is what we set out to achieve and we've achieved that. And there are parts around representation. So improving representation, yes. Retention. But actually for me, it's about the experience. What is your experience like of policing? What's the environment like in the organisation for those of us who work in policing? But what is the experience like for the communities that we serve, and what are we giving to them? So I don't have all of the answers, but I think what we do need is a clarity of what does success look like, so that we know when we've got there, and also we know when we haven't got there.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think it is important, or not do you think it is important? I think we should rephrase that question to, why do you think it's important to have women of colour in policing?
I guess it's back to that point about trust and confidence that we speak about a lot, and representing the community in a really authentic way. And there's so few, they're so rare. And in fact, until I put a uniform on myself, I don't think I'd ever seen a woman, a black woman in a uniform. And it's interesting when you are out in the community, and not so much now, but as a young officer. And I remember seeing a little girl who was, she was missing. She'd been separated from her family. And she was a little mixed race girl, looked like, in a lot of ways, looked just like me. And it's really interesting to see the look on their face then when they see you, and not just for her, but for her family as well. And there's something about trust, acknowledgement, recognition, and not just in those situations, but more broadly in terms of just diversity in general within the community. But if we take aside from policing, I guess the question for me is, why is it important that black women are represented in any role? I think it's important that they are, and that they realise that they don't fit into a specific role in a specific industry, that they can and should be anything that they want to be. And policing is one of those roles, absolutely.
And, you talk about representation, which was my next question. Senior women, now you're a senior woman in policing, and to be quite frank, you're a bit like a unicorn. There's not many of you. What can we better do to improve that representation throughout all of our ranks?
I think this has been a challenge that we've been working for women, and of course women of colour. And I think we're making great strides in terms of that representation, but we're not seeing it come through, as you say, in those senior and indeed executive level roles. And again, that takes time, because you need a pipeline of experience, and there's a plethora of challenges, isn't there? And we're back to that intersectionality piece. I've got 2 children, and when they came along, it's like a little hand grenade in terms of, your ability to dedicate your time to your career. So what does that mean for us as women? So there's a whole range of things. I think for me, it's about maintaining the aspiration, women's aspirations, making sure that they see their place in leadership, if that's where they want their place. Not everybody wants their place to be in leadership, but they see their place there, and that actually they see their route to get there as well. I think we've got to be practical about that. How do we create networks that support women to take the talent that they have, the experience that they have, the potential that they have, and turn that into becoming a senior leader? We know that they exist in more abundance for our male colleagues for a lot of reasons around about natural networks. And again, that's why I believe the SWDF and the subcommittee is so important, because a huge part of our activity is leaning into that, knowing that women are talented, they have the ability, they have the experience, they have the aspiration, and we're just there to make sure that they get access to those opportunities.
And talking about leaning in, our organisation, Police Scotland, has of course created the Policing Together strategy.
Yeah.
You know, there's elements of that are, I think, across UK policing, just, best in class, really, really good initiative. Have you found anything within that strategy in particular that's been beneficial so far? Anything that you would, like to see improvements in?
I think what I like about Policing Together is there's that term that was criticised about the police, about initiative-itis, wasn't there? And the Policing Together strategy is, the DCC calls it an organisational effort. And I do think that's what it is. And it's a long-term effort. And it's got so many different strands that come together. But there's two things that stand out for me. First of all, and I spoke about the Semper event and hearing the lived experiences of officers. So I think, first of all, listening to people. We've got surveys, opportunities for people to speak and share their experience. I think doing that honestly and openly, I think that is a really positive step for Policing Together. The Truth to Power sessions that have existed for quite a long time, actually, and the really positive engagement with staff associations. So hearing people, but it's not just about hearing from those people who are underrepresented. I think it's about hearing, well, how do the other people within the organisation feel? How is this landing with them? I think we know that for some officers and staff, they've struggled to understand the meaning behind Sir Ian's statement, for example. So open and honest conversations for everybody, I think, has been a real positive aspect of Policing Together. The second part for me, and the part that I think if we needed to focus on and must maintain the momentum around, would be this, is the leadership training. We've started with that. There's more to come. Frontline leaders are so important. They're looking after the people that are coming into the organisation, and of course they're our strategic and senior leaders of the future. So I think for me, really good quality leadership training, but is training the right word, or is it awareness? Is it conversations? I'm not sure, but investing in them has been for me, has been a positive part of Policing Together. I'd like to see more of that.
Oh, I absolutely agree with you. It needs to be part of an ongoing conversation, doesn't it? So, reflecting on your career of 23 years, what would be your message to a woman of colour, or indeed anyone on considering a future in policing?
I guess going back to what I said at the start is I can honestly say I have loved and still do love my job. The satisfaction that you get from it, and I think that's true of any role that you do in the police, is immeasurable, and it's got so many choices. I would argue that there really is something for everybody in the police. So yeah, absolutely. It's a career of choice. It's a job where you'll make friendships and relationships that will last a lifetime. But for women of colour, I think I go back to that idea of you can't be what you can't see. You can, and actually you should, because if you don't, it'll never change. So I think for women of colour, it might feel that looking from an outsider in, it might feel that there's not a lot of women of colour in the police. It might be a fear of feeling isolated or alienated. I would reassure them that doesn't need to be the case. That for me, as much as there were challenges, there are so many fantastic people within policing. The SWDF is here. The Women of Colour in Policing Subcommittee is here. If it's what you want, if you want a job where you make a difference, where it's never boring, where you get to do something different every day, then yeah, absolutely, do it.
Well, Joanne, that's brought us to the end of our podcast, and I have to say it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you and listen to some of your experiences, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you're interested in a career in policing, you could visit the Police Scotland website at scotland.police.uk. And if you'd like to find out more about the Scottish Women's Development Forum, you can check out our website, which is scottishwdf.com. This has been a TwaBoldLassies production for the Scottish Women's Development Forum.